Welcome to this morning's Newsmaker here at the National Press Club. School choice, what works, what doesn't, and what will they say about it on the campaign trail? And perhaps most importantly, is it true? That is the topic of this morning's panel discussion. With us we have Dr. Kevin Wellner of the University of Colorado and the director of the National Education Policy Center. We have Dr. Gary Miron of Western Michigan University. Dr. Alex Medler, he's the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Mary Filardo is with us. She is the Executive Director of the District of Columbia's 21st Century School Fund. And finally, Dr. Adam Schaefer is a policy analyst. He's with the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. I also want to point out that Drs. Wellner and Miron are two contributors to a new book that's called Exploring the School Choice Universe, Evidence and Recommendations. It's being released this week, and the book raises questions that are critical to the performance of school choice programs. Just to lay down a bit of the ground rules, first of all, we're going to have statements from our panelists, and the remainder of the time will be reserved for questions, which start with who, what, when, where, why, how, not pontification, and I will be holding everyone to that. I also want to ask that anyone coming in, please make sure that the ringers, buzzers, vibrators on your telephones, pagers, whatever else are turned off. We do not want to be rude to our speakers while they're talking. So, Dr. Wellner, are you to begin?
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Education is shaping up to be a major issue in this education cycle, in this election cycle, excuse me. The president has devoted the past week to education, starting with a radio address on Saturday, and continuing with a swing through Ohio, and then yesterday he was in Las Vegas talking about budget cuts and teachers and growing class size. School choice is a big part of the education discussion. Governor Romney has made the voucherization of Title I and IDEA, or special education funding, a centerpiece of his educational policy. Essentially what he's promoting is federal vouchers. And his proposed policy would mark a huge change in the federal role. President Obama has also strongly promoted school choice policies, particularly charter schools. His strategy relies to a great extent on scaling up nonprofit education management organizations that are thought to be successful in working with students in high poverty communities. But as we'll discuss, vouchers and charter schools are only two of the many types of school choice. And one voucher or charter policy can look and act very differently from another. So what is school choice? And how can we most sensibly understand and use school choice? Gary Miron and I, along with two of our colleagues at the National Education Policy Center, Patricia Hinchy and Bill Mathis, we set out to answer that. And our project resulted in the book that Jamila Bey just mentioned, exploring the school choice universe. The main rationale for this project was that while there are scores of other school choice books out there, they cover only one or two topics, or more often, one or two types of choice. So the first thing we did was to think about all the issues prompted by choice-based policies. Listen to this list. It's surprising how many issues there are. We have basic philosophical and democracy issues. We have questions about legality and litigation, how parents make choices, who chooses and why, how choice schools are held accountable, how choice is funded, and what incentives arise out of those funding choices. Teacher quality issues, questions about innovation and innovativeness, effects on segregation and stratification, competition effects of choice schools upon other schools, and of course the effects of choice policies on measured student outcomes. So for the book, we asked experts in each one of these topics to tell us what research, what is the evidence base on all these different issues. But we also started to think about, what do we mean by school choice? School choice isn't a single thing, so we identified a half dozen different types of choice. Charters and vouchers were certainly two of those, but we also pointed authors to homeschooling, to cyber schools, to magnet schools and other types of intra-district school choice, often called open enrollment policies, to between-district school choice, and to tuition tax credits that provide a public subsidy to private school tuition, similar to vouchers. I call these neo-vouchers. Now, before I hand this over to Gary Miron, I want to give a preliminary answer to my earlier question: what is school choice? There is a widespread misconception about school choice, that it's a complete policy in itself. In reality, it's a broad policy tool that can be included as part of a complete policy, of a complete education policy. It's not a policy in itself any more than professional development is a policy in itself, or bell schedules are a policy in themselves. At the most basic level, school choice is simply an approach to student assignment. I might tell you, for instance, I favor school choice, and my statement can be coherent in the sense that I might be a libertarian, or that I buy into certain assumptions about the benefits of competition or whatnot. But when you hear me make a statement like, I favor school choice, your next question should be, well, how do you favor structuring or using school choice? That is, what does your policy using school choice actually look like? Let me end with something that I hope will provoke some conversation as we open this up. It seems to me that our lawmakers and our candidates for office are not, in fact, asking these sensible questions. It seems like they're wrongly looking at school choice as a policy, not as a tool. And this misunderstanding blinds them to all the ways that school choice tools can be used. So we end up with choice-based policies that have a set of rules arrived at through default or through political pressure, rather than careful and hopefully evidence-based deliberation. Simply put, if we don't ask the right questions, we don't tend to get the right answers. Thank you. Gary?
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I want to cover three general points. I want to talk about the arguments for and against school choice. I want to share a few comments about the overall prevalence of school choice, how many students are participating in choice programs across the nation. And I also want to talk again about this point about the importance of policy for policymakers to be thoughtful as they plan, develop, and implement school choice programs. But first, let's talk about the arguments. One of the key arguments that we see raised up about school choice is that it's going to bring in that entrepreneurial spirit into our education system, and that through competition, schools will get their acts together and perform better. And this is an argument that we often hear. On the other side, opponents often say that that competition also comes with profit making, because we're bringing in private groups that are going to bring that entrepreneurial spirit, and there'll be winners and losers. There's also a concern from the opponents that with this competition, with the involvement of private actors, that we're going to lose control of the schools, mostly through privatization. Another argument for school choice is the way that when parents can look at their students' unique needs, they can identify school choices that would best match those needs. And the school system can be more efficient and effective when schools are, with their unique learning styles and unique pedagogical profiles, when those are matched with students when parents match their students with those different choices, we're going to have better schools. With that sorting preference, that's one argument for. On the other hand, opponents are often saying, well, there's sorting that goes on, but the sorting can occur by demographics, and that school choice can promote segregation by race, by class, by ability, and also by the language of instruction. And so this is what some of the opponents are rather concerned about. On the one hand, some of the arguments for choice are about quality. This is a way to pursue quality. Opponents, on the other hand, are saying equality. We have to be concerned about equality in the education system. So we hear these arguments back and forth. There's been a lot written about these and other arguments for and against school choice. Much of this has been rhetorical in nature, and what we've tried to do in this volume is to bring together authors that are going to summarize the empirical evidence on school choice and to provide a better basis for policymakers and others as they think thoughtfully about school choice. Let's talk about prevalence and how many students we actually have in school choice programs. It was rather surprising for us to find that in the nation as a whole and across those 6 categories or 6 types of school choice that we looked at, close to 30% of the nation's public school students are choosing another school than the one that they are assigned to. Over the years, there's been a lot of attention given to vouchers, and in the last 2 decades, more attention given to charter schools. But when we look at the overall picture, and we have a chart there, here that depicts the enrollments in different types of school choice options, it's the inter-district or intra-district choice programs. It's within the public school sector where most choice is taking place, and close to 9 million students are participating in that kind of choice. When we get down to the other types of choice, there's some new programs or reforms that are taking off. Charter schools continue to grow as an option, providing more options for school choice. Today, about 1.9 million of our students in the nation are in charter schools. Homeschooling we consider as an option of choice, and we have about 2 million students in the nation that participate in homeschooling. And this is more than what we see in many other nations. That's about 3% of all students in the country are in homeschool provisions. And then we have a couple other things that are growing more rapidly, particularly virtual schools. In these virtual schools, today they number about 250,000 students in the nation are in full-time virtual schools. And it's growing rapidly, and we're seeing more attention to this, especially with many states lifting their caps now on virtual schools. And this also is growing very rapidly because when a virtual school opens, they can often open with 4,000 to 5,000 students in the first year, and some of them grow to be more than 11,000 students in the space of a few years. And last point I want to take up is about this need for more thoughtful policy making, especially when it comes to school choice. And this is something that we underline again and again throughout the book. I shared last year in the Michigan Senate, I shared testimony about the importance of a thoughtful policy making when it comes to school choice. And the senator at the time who was sponsoring the bill to lift the cap on charter schools and virtual schools in Michigan, he had suggested that I was against school choice, and he said that what am I supposed to tell these 40 families that have researched and found a really successful charter schools? And he was suggesting that he didn't think that those families should be able to take advantage of that choice. And I was very polite in my response to the senator, but I reminded him that, yes, you have to be concerned about those 40 families, but what about the 60 families that are choosing a charter school that won't be successful? And what about all the other students that are left behind? And when we think about school choice, we have to think about all these groups. Because we don't want it, if we're going to look at the education system as a whole, we don't want it to be winners and losers. We want to find a place where the system can serve all, and we have to be concerned about those. In the book, again, we encourage policymakers to revisit the goals, the overall goals for our education system. And looking at those goals for the education system, then go ahead and plan, design, and implement school choice reforms that are going to pursue those goals. And not let school choice be an end of itself, but instead be a tool that can be used to pursue those common goals and also to pursue the common or best interest for all students. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Miron. Next, let's just go down the line and have you, Dr. Adam Schaefer, again, policy analyst with the Center for Educational Freedom at Cato.
Oh, thank you for having me here today. My perspective is a little different a lot of times than, do you want, why not?
Yeah, for your
okay.
statement.
All right.
You've got the podium music, lectern technically.
We're on the opposite side of the school choice issue a lot of times, but I find that I often agree with you on some particulars. Not surprising, one of those things I agree on is the interesting aspects of education tax credits, which vouchers get the lion's share of attention. Your book, Vouchers, all absent the title, which I think is a little tenditious, but is a great kind of overview of what's going on in that policy space. But I think you hit on something that is extremely important and has been an increasing concern of my own, which is choice isn't a policy. And there is a huge amount of diversity in the choice policy space. I would disagree a little bit in the fact that I think it can be a policy, but saying I support school choice, that's almost meaningless. When Randy Weingarten of the teachers unions and the most ardent free marketers all say that they support school choice, what does it really mean? Does it have any meaning left? And I think not. You have to look at the specific policies. So in the space, charter schools are still government schools. The approval of the pedagogical approach, the approval of the schools rests on the authority of a government-sponsored board. Private schools can't apply, obviously. It's a public charter school, although private operators can run the schools. They can't teach religion in the school. And the diversity is limited by the perspective and the vision of the charter authorizers, ultimately. In the private sector, vouchers and tax credits open up options in the private sphere. But vouchers use government funds, and this typically requires regulations to provide accountability of some sort to taxpayers who fund the program. Tax credits, on the other hand, are entirely funded within the private sphere and distributed through private nonprofit organizations. The taxpayer who earned the funds in the first place is allowed to direct those funds to the school that comports with their values and they think is doing a good job. And so there's layers of private accountability there and accountability directly to the taxpayer that don't necessitate this regulatory structure that we find invariably in voucher schools. So I think this is an extremely important thing to consider, and I'm happy you've written a book that gets into a little bit more detail on it. Everyone's a choice supporter now, but we all have to decide, I think, what kind of choice supporter we are. It's not good enough now to say, I support school choice. We need to get into the nitty-gritty of the policy details, what's really going on in the guts. And there's huge variation, I'm sure you're going to discuss, in charter authorizers and the structure of charter school systems, how they're authorized, how their charter can be revoked, if it's revoked, how often does it happen, on what criterion is it revoked. In the voucher space, what kind of regulatory structure do we have for voucher schools to ensure accountability to the taxpayers? Is parental choice enough? In most of the systems, they say no. There's a huge fight in Louisiana right now going on over this question. Should creation of schools be allowed to participate in the voucher program in Louisiana? Should an Islamic school? This came up recently. A conservative voucher school supporter was upset by the fact that all religious schools could participate. With education tax credits, is the 3 layers of accountability in the private sector enough? The accountability to parents, the accountability to a nonprofit association that passes out the scholarships, and the accountability to the taxpayer who funded those scholarship organizations in the first place. Is that enough for us to be happy with? So I would say yes. I think this is important. The outcomes of these programs in terms of their impact on achievement and other measurable effects on student performance, on graduation rates, is hugely important. But also, as you pointed out, people support different policies for multitudes of reasons. And I think the ability for parents to take control of their child's education and direct it in a way that they see fit is a hugely important thing. And something that should be a huge part of the consideration, not just get lost in these metrics. Although I would point out, just today there's a release of a study looking at the graduation effect of a voucher program, private voucher program in New York City from many years back. These kids are now going to college, and they found a huge increase in graduation rates among the children who received the lottery assigned, randomly assigned voucher compared to those who lost out. So I'll leave it at that because I think we probably have a lot to discuss. But I encourage everyone to take a look at this book and really consider the differences between these different options and what a system and a real policy structure means. It's not just a name. It's not just increasing choice, because all these systems have potentially radically different results. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Alex Medler. I work with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, and I find the whole book very interesting, and I'd recommend you dig into its details, but I'm going to speak a little bit about choice in general and then probably a little bit more about charters. I'd agree that a key lesson from this, and that we should take into our policy discussions or political discussions and implementation, is that details matter, policies matter, structures matter. I'd also add that who's acting matters. So this is another book about school choice and charters. I look forward to seeing the hard copy, but for the last few that have come out, authorizers don't even make it into the index. So not to mention getting their own chapter. And the treatment here is not a lot deeper. It's starting to recognize it, but the spirit is correct, that we need to look at the details, we need to look at who's acting. And I'd say one of the things that's important is to realize that as you look at more and more different topics and you take into account different purposes and everything that's going on, it becomes harder and harder to simplify and to say, well, what's the bottom line? So for a reporter or a policymaker who says, was it working or not? It's like, well, it depends on what you think working is and what your goal was, and it depends on which one you look at. So that's a frustrating answer, but it's actually pointing where some promise is. I say it has some promise when we realize that the decisions that, let's say, a school board makes or a commissioner of education makes about whether to approve a particular charter school affect that school. And then they need policies and tools that help them make individual decisions. And those individual decisions, just like in markets of choice, the actions of policymakers come together to give us the overall picture. So what I mean to say is that charter schools, on average, performing equal or better than traditional schools isn't such an important question. What's important is how is the distribution of the schools? Are there more good ones and more bad ones? If there's both extra good schools and extra bad schools, that's different than saying on average they're just a little bit better. So the fact that we have too many bad charter schools but a whole bunch of good schools, that's something we can act on. We can't act on the data that charter schools are on average a little bit better or worse. So school boards can close the bad ones, they can replicate the good ones. We will never get rid of the charter school movement, we will never get rid of choice. It's already there. People want it, they won't tolerate us getting rid of it. So the question is, what decisions should we make? The policies affect how people make those individual decisions, and authorizers decide which schools should close, which schools should open, and they encourage which one to replicate. And those decisions can be informed by real data too. So I'm impressed by the asking, let's understand the nuances and the difference, and I agree with the conclusion that policies matter and that the details matter. We then need to dive into some of those to figure out how to act. I would make one more observation that I think is worth noting, is if we think of, let's say, 10 or 14,000 people choosing their school, I'd argue that we should then add everybody who bought a house since their kid was born, because schools are traditionally assigned in the status quo by your housing. Housing is one of the most segregated things by race and class in America, and so the status quo is based on the choices families have made about where to buy or rent their home. And so there's no option to not choose your school. You do so when you choose where you live, and that's a very inequitable choice in the first place. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. I'll be curious to see which of these different purposes we can dive into today, knowing that we can't get into so much of the meat. But there's a lot of meat out there that's worth exploring, and getting down to a finer level is where this book's going in the right direction.
Good morning. I think because I'm the one furthest from the PhD, I get to speak about it from the ground a little bit more. We work locally with urban districts primarily on community issues associated with education reform, a lot related to facilities, as it as it works out. And so we've ended up in this choice space because of the educational facility planning issues and also because of the policy issues related to planning. So one of the things that as we look at choice, we see it as, you know, sort of the discussion related to Brown v. Board. It was a student assignment case that went to the Supreme Court. And it's obviously a very contentious thing, student assignment. And choice itself is a very contentious issue, and not just about personal choice, but also about the set of systems that kind of respond to that. And in the District of Columbia right now, the chancellor is just going to start a process of looking at the student assignment policies and the choices that parents have. And one of the things, as we've looked at it already to some extent, the data on it is, what we're finding is who's really choosing? Are the parents actually the ones controlling the choice, or is it the operators controlling the choice? In the District of Columbia, you have a right to get into a lottery, but you don't actually have the right to stay at that school. So there's some real differences in this, and I was delighted to learn about the book, because I think that for the communities on the ground trying to figure out where kids get to go, who's going where, that we really do need this larger frame to look at it, because it's not necessarily as ideologically it's framed, whether from one version or another, whether it's like greater equity, well, not necessarily. More equality, well, you know, maybe not. Better quality in terms of the school achievement, sometimes not. So it's a very complicated issue, and I think that one of the things that we're very concerned about is that we actually think the democratic processes associated with navigating these various reasons to have a choice system need to be at the heart of it, because it's not clear, it's not simple. You know, parents who should have the forum to look at religious differences or quality differences or instructional program differences, they should do that, but they should be doing that in public space around a publicly governed, we believe, and elected, I would argue also, body that really is trying to navigate our biases, our values, and they're part of that's part of what makes us a community. And I think that some of what we've seen in the District of Columbia, and we're working with folks in Chicago and in New York City, is that when the system is defined to be, you know, what's the best choice for your child, as opposed to really a citizenry saying kind of, how do we want the next generation to sort of learn from the knowledge that we sort of evolved and are trying to preserve over time, and how do we want our communities to be, that we've really lost a fabric to community that is essential to civil society. And one of the characteristics of choice is that it isn't place-based. And so while there are enormous issues around the segregation of our communities, we find that in many places our communities might be more integrated than our schools. And so I think that you know, kind of wrestling with that certainly is part of what we're going to be doing here in the District of Columbia. Boston is doing it right now. Other cities and communities are trying to figure this out. And anyway, I think it's a real service, quite honestly, and hopefully we'll be able to translate the work that you've done and get it sort of in the hands of districts and communities as we try to figure this out in the District of Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks one and all. Let's open the floor for questions. We've got a bit of time. Let's get started. All right, well, I guess I have the, oh.
Can I jump in and
Oh,
respond to
please
something
do,
that
yeah.
So I wanted to pick up on the last point that Mary made, which was that in a lot of places, what we see in choice schools is an amplification of the stratification we see in neighborhoods. And that flies in the face of a lot of initial motivation of school choice advocates who looked at segregated residential areas and said, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to have what are called catchment areas or neighborhood assignment to schools. We could open this up, and that will alleviate a lot of what we see in terms of what I think it was Alex mentioned, the idea that one form of school choice is you buy a house in a neighborhood that serves a particular school, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so the idea of using school choice to alleviate neighborhood segregation was part of the initial motivation. And it's depressing that we see the opposite happening, that we see sort of a layer of stratification on top of housing segregation. And when we talk about segregation and stratification, we're talking not just about racially identifiable schools, but also by class, by test score, by English language ability, by special needs. Am I forgetting anything? That's pretty much. And so we see all these forms of stratification in different forms of school choice. Now there are major exceptions to this, and when we use sort of general, it tends to be sorts of statements, it's important to recognize that there are exceptions. But when we're talking about sort of the overall patterns, that is what we see. But again, it still doesn't have to be that way. We can design school choice plans with our goals in mind and then work backwards to how we're structuring the role of choice as a tool within those policies. So we could set up, I mean, I think Omaha, Nebraska has a plan, if I'm remembering the right place, I think it is. Omaha, Nebraska has a inter-district school choice plan that serves to alleviate stratification, alleviate segregation. And other places have also tried this and found it to be successful, whether by race, by income. I mean, there's the famous Wake County, North Carolina plan, which uses family income and wealth as a tool within a choice plan to make sure that schools aren't as stratified. So it's important to think of school choice as something that can be inserted in a plan that can accomplish larger goals that we have as a society, and one of those certainly can be the issue that Mary raised, which is segregation or stratification.
If I could respond, this dovetails with something that struck me as I was listening about the issue of the assignment of children to schools, and it struck me that that term, student assignment, I find really offensive. The notion that some government board or political board or whomever it is assigning your child to the place that they're supposed to learn. And when people talk about larger goals, serving the larger goals of society, especially when it's in the context of using your children to pursue those larger goals, I get very, very nervous. Are any of these larger goals more important, or for that matter, better served by the government structuring a plan to serve those societal goals than it is for parents who love their child, know their child, to pursue their individual goals of having their life be the best that it can be? I mean, aren't our larger goals that kids can read, that kids are successful, that kids don't get killed in school, that they don't get hurt in school? These should be our goals, and if they are, these are the same goals as parents have, except for parents have a greater incentive to pursue those goals. And it doesn't get lost in the system. So when we talk about student assignment and serving the larger goals of society through how we assign children to the environment that they're supposed to be in for 12 years and is the basis of their life outcome, that makes me really concerned.
So, there is compulsory attendance in the United States, virtually state by state, right? So parents are compelled to send their children to school.
That's different than the government body assigning.
Right, but essentially the government body is a locally, in most instances, a locally elected school board. And so while I know that you would think of government as sort of evil, bad, I think of, but hang on, but I would, right, but, right, I would say, I would say that the government represents essentially the collective view of a group of people, which are not just parents and not just, and I think that's right.
Do you think a collective body should raise our children?
They're not raising them. They're essentially defining how you allocate public education to families.
Well, if I might,
that's clarified.
Well, the book, the book and this discussion can definitely raise lots of deep philosophical issues about what is the public and what is the public good, and the opening chapters do that. But I'd like to address another sort of specific piece of what Kevin just said. So charter school authorizers are I should define them. They're the entities that decide who gets a charter when people apply. They write the contract that monitors them. If a school doesn't perform or does perform, they make the decision whether to renew it or not. And so when we have an overall goal like, I'll use your words, make sure schools are not stratified, the vehicle that a school board would have or the State Board of Education would have, they get to say yes or no to a charter application. There's no abstaining. There's no going back necessarily right away and redesigning the whole policy structure. So there's 1,000 entities out there today who have to make yes or no votes on an individual school. So I'll give you Denver, for example. 2 schools illustrate this perfectly. Denver School of Science and Technology is originally created to create a diverse school with more, frankly, whites in it than are in the rest of the public schools in Denver, because they had decades of white flight. So they intentionally put it in a place. They designed a program that would be attractive like magnet schools, and it succeeded. It has demographics that look like Denver's population, but that means it's more white than the traditional schools that the whites have left in general. Meanwhile, West Denver Prep has almost 100% low-income minority kids. It has incredible results, 90th growth percentile, proficiency rates you wouldn't see elsewhere. That school is intensely more all one race or poverty than the rest of the district, but the families love it. The question before the school board was, should we have more of them? So Mike, if we're going to make sure schools are not stratified, would you have denied Denver School of Science and Technology? Would you have denied West Denver Prep or close it down? Would you not? Denver looked at those decisions and they said, we need more elementary schools that serve ELL kids successfully, and we need them in the northwest corner of the city. They did an RFP and they asked West Denver Prep to apply, and they now have 4 more charters and they're creating more schools with similar results. Those schools are also all minority. Is that a bad thing for the society? And should we weigh the greater societal good of making sure we're not stratified against schools that are demonstrably succeeding and doing great things with kids who need better choices? So the choices, the philosophy about what's public and what is democracy is one thing, but for a school board member in Denver, the question is, should I have more of the good ones and should I have fewer of the bad ones?
Okay, over here to Dr. Maron.
Adam has brought us down to the very crux of the issue, which is values. And we talk about how important it is for the government and policymakers to articulate the goals and then to carefully and thoughtfully implement choice plans. But it's really about values and about whether we see education as a public good or a private good. In Adam's perspective, he's talking very much about the private good. Parents invest, parents take decisions. There's winners or losers. Some kids will get good options, some won't. We believe school choice can serve both, but even with school choice itself, if it's thoughtfully implemented, it can serve the public's broader goals. And I think an example of that is just what Alex has taken up with a thoughtful charter school initiative or thoughtful use of planning that can counteract and serve the public good and still promote choice options, but still pursue those publicly stated goals that are envisioned to serve all students and look out for students' best interest, all students.
So the the public good versus private good thing is I know a serious issue, but in my mind, the public good is a byproduct of the private good, right? I mean, the public good are the ramifications of the benefits of children being better educated and having better life outcomes, and the externalities, the positive externalities of those. So that's an argument possibly for subsidizing education, especially for low-income children who can't buy enough quality of an education. And no one here really is arguing at that point. People who support vouchers or tax credits, these are all ways of ensuring that even the poorest in society are ensured enough funding, enough opportunity to get a good education. In other words, there is no conflict between the public goods that we all agree on, which is a better educated, more fulfilled citizenry. That's the product of good education. And so the real question is, what system gets us the best education? And what's the most feasible? In my mind, you look at the evidence, and you could do class size reduction and spend billions upon billions more to get it down to like 5 kids per class. You could try intra-district choice or charter schools, which sometimes there's some evidence of magnet schools and charter schools actually performing better. But to me, I look at the evidence and the balance of the evidence. The random assignment studies out of voucher and even tax credit studies demonstrate if you want to, for less money, and we're not talking about, you know, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you do? If you want long-term impacts on student achievement and life outcomes, you go with private school choice, vouchers and education tax credits. In Florida, in countless voucher programs that they've studied, the net effect is positive or a wash at worst. And these are tiny, tiny programs that couldn't even be remotely called a true market. And so, you know, the question for me is what public good or what public purpose is there beyond a better educated populace? And if we do go beyond those, what right does the government have to decide, well, your child shouldn't have a religious education or shouldn't be allowed to, or they need to only have this kind of pedagogical approach, even if you think it's the best, and it turns out that it is?
There's a lot there, Adam. The part of it is claims about outcomes of different choice plans are really problematic. We have a chapter actually written by Gary in the book, Gary and some of his colleagues, that walks through all the different studies of different types of choice. Now, interestingly enough, charter schools and vouchers, not neo-vouchers, not the tax credit vouchers, but the conventional voucher type, charter school and vouchers have been studied a lot. Particularly charter schools, particularly given how relatively new and how quickly the policy has expanded. Other types of school choice have not been studied nearly as well in terms of really being able to make strong judgments about how well they're doing. With regard to charters and conventional vouchers, I think a wash is probably the most global statement we can make. There have been a lot of voucher studies and even reanalyses of initial data of voucher studies that have been done by advocates of school vouchers, and that's why we oftentimes see reanalysis of the same data and reaching different conclusions from the original authors. But even those advocate studies tend to show a wash with occasional blips of success. So what we see is
That's just not the case, actually. I mean, the balance of the studies, you can count them up. Find a small but significant.
So
a small but
we actually
significant effect.
we don't use counting
evidence.
Approaches to decide whether or not the research base supports something.
They're called meta studies.
No, meta-analyses are very different than counting up what different results.
I understand that, but when you look at the totality, at worst it's a wash for a lot less money. And when you add in the studies that show a competitive effect from private choice programs on the performance of public schools, then what you have is them keeping up with the improvements from competition in the private sector. David Figlu has extremely good studies on the Florida program, which is a tax credit program, both showing that the students maintain parity with equivalent students in the public schools, and that there's a competitive effect from the education tax credit program.
Getting hot and heavy up here.
I actually wanted to finish, so okay. I won't go back and forth with this, but clearly we disagree. But I also want to get to this issue of...
Well, what do we disagree about?
Quite a bit, actually, Adam. So what I did want to touch on was the main point I think that you were making, which is the question of how much do we rely on individual parent choices to drive the overall public good. There was a New Yorker cartoon this past year that had these two mothers walking along a sidewalk, and one mother is talking to the other, and her daughter is walking a little bit in front with a nice school uniform on. And one mother is talking to the other and says, "You know, it wasn't our first choice in schools, but we had a Groupon for it, so what the hell?" And I think that it's important to recognize that, I mean, this is sort of a fun way of getting at an important issue, which is that sometimes the choices that parents make are strongly evidence-based, sometimes they're nonsensical, sometimes they're even harmful. And just as importantly, the information and the practical choices available to different parents in different groups within our society are very different, depending on other resources those parents have, transportation certainly being key among them, but also knowledge and skill and understanding information that's available or not available to the parents. and also in the ability to sort of negotiate within different choice systems. Alex Medler and I go way back, probably a decade or so, and we've had a lot of interesting conversations about this idea of how do we make school choice most effective for people across the board in our society? How do we overcome some of these barriers that stop, that make big sort of obstacles that some parents face and other parents don't face, and how to sort of make that a more level playing field? I think that's a really important point.
Okay, what's going to happen? I want Mary to respond, and then I'm going to go to the audience for questions. So,
Yeah, I just, you know, for me, the argument about kind of who's getting the better test scores is not, it should not be the heart of it, especially when we are, for the most part, talking about margins in any of these systems. So it's a marginal change, and I, you know, would argue that the importance of voice and communities really wrestling with these things is critical to what we are as a society, to not stratifying by religion, to not stratifying by race, to not stratifying by income or culture, and that the space, and this is, you know, spoken as, you know, a parent who went through DC public schools with 3 of my children in a bilingual setting where, you know, there were mostly Salvadoran refugees at the school and African American, you know, at various points in time. And there was enormous value to us wrestling with trying to understand each other's culture and values. And I think that, you know, that we tend to, you know, want to go to our comfort zones. And I think that part of what public education does, and I think some of the charter schools work at it intentionally, and I would argue that many of the traditional public schools don't do it well. I mean, it's not that it's solved there, but I think that wrestling with this in community is an absolutely essential part of why we are a civil society at best, a little bit still, and what we need to do in order to retain some of that civility.
okay. We're going to ask you, sir, to ask your question. Wait for the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions.
Okay. No.
I don't think I really need it, but are there many schools these days that you enter by taking a test, which, of course, you would get integration that way? For example, a school I'm familiar with in Cincinnati, Walnut Hills, you have to take a test to get into that school, and that school has been there for, I think, many, many decades, and it seemed to work well. That's one question. The other is, when you've got these stratified schools, all white, all black, are the faculties integrated? In other words, in an all-white school, you have many African-American teachers. In an all-black school, if you have many white teachers. I was curious.
I could take both of those on really quickly.
Yeah.
The second question is, in general, the teaching force tends to be a lot more white and female than the overall student body. There are schools, particularly, I think it's true that some charter schools serving areas that are largely Latino or largely African American will make an effort to have a teaching force that's more reflective of that population. And I know Teach for America, for example, another organization, has tried recently to try to diversify its teaching force a little more, because those are the schools that those teachers tend to serve. So there's some recognition of that and some attempts to address it. But overall, the teaching population tends to be more white and female. The first question dealt with test-based admissions to schools. I think the most well-known are the New York test-based schools, New York City test-based schools. There have been several attempts to try to tease out what's going on in terms of equity at those schools, in terms of whether or not that test-based process is fair and equitable to students, because we do tend to see, certainly in New York, we see a lot whiter student population and wealthier student population in those schools than in the city as a whole. And the measurement precision of those tests that are used tend to have a wide error band. If you think about like presidential polling, when they talk about plus or minus 5 points, that sort of thing. If you think about tests having a similar error band, you have students being excluded or included in those schools when there's really no difference in their test scores. So that's part of the issue.
Okay. Back here, can we pass the mic? Thank you.
My question is for Alex and for Gary. Alex, you talked about the importance of the role of authorizers and argued that you needed at least a chapter in this book, if not more, and the importance of the authorizers as being able to close down low-performing charters. However, we see in states like Ohio, in Michigan, in Florida, in Arizona, an extraordinary number or percentage of very low-performing charters that are not being closed down. And I think Gary has written about this as well. So I'd like your perspective. Your work for the National Association of Charter Authorizers. What are you guys doing to encourage authorizers to have the guts and the conviction to close down low-performing charters? And Gary, I'd like your perspective on that as well.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And we're doing quite a bit. We share the observation that there are too many charter schools that are operating that shouldn't be, and that when they come up for renewal, some schools are renewed that shouldn't have been. So it depends on which state you're in. The number and the proportion will change dramatically. Charters vary by state, but wherever you go, there are charter schools that are unlikely to close. One of the things I do when I travel around working with policymakers or authorizers is I ask, in your state, how many charter schools are operating that you wouldn't send your kids or your friends' kids to that you wish somebody had closed? And everyone can visualize a number. And then I say, well, how many schools recently have been closed that you really think should have stayed open? And the ratio is always there's a lot more that need to close and almost none that are pretty good that were closed for the wrong reason. So we need to ratchet up the policies and the tools so that people can make those decisions. On the ground, we work with authorizers, A, to pick schools better in the first place and have rigorous process up front, but B, we try to have them have performance frameworks that measure with a balanced scorecard, a bunch of measures, particularly student growth. We try to make those match to the contracts authorizers have. We are working with state policymakers to rewrite the state laws to recognize the legitimacy of those contracts and the expectations, and then we work with it to try to give the authorizers the information they need, and then to make sure that they're clear that the process is not about who screams the loudest, but that it's about what's best for kids, and they're looking at that data. With all those things in place, we're seeing some model authorizers that are able to have the will, they're able to act on it. When they make the decision, it's able to be sustained. So there are things you can do in policy and practice and collectively with communications to make that happen more often. And we're encouraged that it can happen, and we're working on it a lot in the next few years.
Now, when we look at the charter school results, it's important to recognize there's very big differences between and within states. But when we talk about those between state differences, some states are doing better with their charter school reforms than others. In part, I think it comes back to the values issue. When we see bipartisan support for a charter school law, we tend to see smaller numbers of charter schools and a more focus on oversight and quality. And then when we see a more partisan approach, we often see the values coming in, which is the belief through competition that the quality of the charter schools isn't as important as the quantity. The more that we get, the more competitive pressure will be applied to the traditional public schools. And now when we look at the overall evidence, we see that the charter schools, the states with the largest charter schools, the largest number of charter schools, tend to perform less well. The states with the fastest growing charter school reforms tend to perform less well. It's the states with the smaller numbers and also the states with more closures that we're seeing that. When, closing poor performing charter schools is important for a number of reasons. One, it sends a signal to the other schools that they really have to be accountable, or they can have their schools, their charter revoked. But it also lifts the aggregate results for those remaining schools. And the third advantage of closing bad schools is that it shifts the limelight, that attention that many of the poor performing schools get, because there are successful charter schools out there that are often overlooked because so much attention is put on those schools that are scandal ridden and struggling.
Gary, I know Adam wants to get in, but I'd like to add one other point. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but we have some states that have such weak or tight laws that there's nothing happening at all. So it's, you know, you need a good law that allows a charter school application to be viewed on its merits so that it has a chance of being approved. Some states have it so that you can't even get there. Once they're there, I'd agree that quality control matters a lot. And I would say NACSA is a pro-charter organization. We want there to be a large, vibrant, successful charter sector. And there are amazing things, innovative things going on in the charter space. And the inability to deal with what's not working, it creates obstacles for those who are hitting it out of the park. And if we can address the problems of failing, festering charter schools, those rock stars and the innovations will be much more credible. The policymakers won't put the clamps on them. People will see it, and its impact will be much greater. So we consider the activity to strengthen the closures and to strengthen the rigor is a very pro-charter step to support innovation and its replication.
There's an interesting tidbit here, and I'll use Life Skills Charter in Denver, which Alex is very familiar with, and it was finally closed down, I think, last year. But the process took, what, 5 years, something like that? And one of the things that was going on there, it raises an issue that I think we also see with cyber charters right now, is that Life Skills said, hey, look, the reason why we have bad results is because we're essentially a mission-driven school. We're out there reaching out to kids who would not be successful in any school. And what we're trying to do is to not so much be a last chance school, but a school that's driven to serve a particular part of the population. And of course, we're going to have low scores. We hear the same thing. Gary and I have both done work recently with cyber charter schools, studying cyber charters. And we hear the same thing, the complaints, when you look at the actual outcomes of these large, they tend to be for-profit companies operating cyber charters. We see very poor measured outcomes. And part of the response, a big part of the response has been, well, that's because kids who opt into these cyber charters are kids who were not successful in the brick and mortar schools that they were in. We're serving a population that would otherwise have low scores. Part of the response to that is to try to look at growth, to try to look at, well, let's see where the kids start at and see where they move. But another part of serving a disadvantaged community. By the way, there's a question as to how disadvantaged the cyber charter population really is, but even accepting that claim, what we also see with a lot of these schools is a lot of mobility. So kids moving in and out a lot, and that makes it very hard to measure growth, because the kid who was there last year or the kid who was there even this fall isn't necessarily there that spring. And so you have issues of attrition and selection that are very difficult when you're talking about figuring out whether these schools really are doing well. And that's part of the reason why I think it's difficult to close some of them, because they have a response to the simple, well, your kids' test score outcomes, for example, are not doing well.
Can I say something really briefly on the alternative education of really extremely at-risk kids is a bit of a wrinkle and a challenge in the charter space, but I'd say this is another one that gets back to values too. I think states and communities need to wrestle with what is it we expect and want public schools to do when a young person is 18 to 20 years old or 16 to 20, so they're still entitled to go to the public schools. They're reading at the 5th or 6th grade level. They're not constitutionally guaranteed to get to go to school for more than 2 years. So what can you do in those 2 years before they become 21? And so first off, we need to figure out which schools, whether they're district or charter or cyber, are serving populations this challenged. And then we need to decide what it is we expect schools to achieve if we're going to evaluate them for it. Denver, with that life skills school you're talking about, they use that performance framework. The state has developed a definition of what counts as a school that's an alternative education campus. They rate those schools so you can actually see the distribution amongst the 20 different schools that serve kids that challenged. And then with that data, they were able to close it and have the state board back them up. So if you wrestle with these values about what you achieve or what you expect, then put in place tools to measure it and educate people that expectations still need to be there, they just need to be different, then you can act.
I just wanted to circle back to one of the things that keeps coming up, which is who decides? Who decides the quality? Who decides what schools operate? Who decides where parents are allowed to go or what's a good school? And you know, the Groupon comment about a parent choosing a school because it was a Groupon, you know, it's a joke, but there's a really sick underbelly to that. And that goes to the heart of this discussion, that I think really the only argument against private school choice and educational freedom is that too many parents are stupid and careless with their children. But ultimately, that's what we're talking about, that they don't have enough information, they're not educated enough, they're not smart enough, and they don't care enough about their children to determine what a better or worse school is. And I find that really offensive, not because I think everyone's a genius, or not because I think every parent is good, but most parents care enough about their child and know enough to determine better or worse. And we see this in voucher programs and charter school programs where parents line up around the block for lotteries to try to get their kid into a school that they know is better than the school they're currently in. It doesn't take a whole lot of brains or a whole lot of education to know better or worse. It doesn't take a whole lot of brains to know your kid can't read, period. And that's the fact of life for a lot of kids at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale today, right now. Now, there are parents that are hopeless lost causes, and we're not talking about these people on the very, very far margins. That's a particular problem in and of itself. But for the vast majority of low-income families, yeah, they do know enough to know better or worse. And the fact of the matter is, even the cheapest car on the market today will still get you to work. That's not true of education. The worst schools, a lot of them in this country, do not educate children to a degree where they can function at a basic level as citizens in this country. So that's the framework we're talking about. And I want to really highlight that because sometimes it gets glossed over. Ha, parents are stupid.
But
yeah, some of them are.
But if parents choose the one that won't get them there, what do you do?
The question is whether they are more likely to choose it than the current system, and whether they're better at discriminating than a government-appointed board or a government-authorized board.
Okay.
That's the question here.
We're winding down on time. I will let you respond, but I need you to brief.
Okay,
Do so.
I do brief sometimes. Adam has a very strong skill at pulling my chain. There is. I mean, I think it's very important to not start to understand that we're starting off by assuming that every parent cares about their kids. Certainly, there are some who are dysfunctional, and we can set that aside. But it's not a matter of caring. It's a matter of efficaciousness. So the solution isn't so much just to sort of hope that every parent chooses the right. No, the solution isn't to figure out a way to make every parent make the right decision between a good school and a bad school. The solution is to have a system that drives all schools toward excellence, rather than a system that stratifies between, using the car example, Mercedes and Yugos, right? So if we have kids in the Yugo classrooms, we have a problem. And whether that came about from a catchment or a traditional assignment process or from a school choice process, it's a problem. And understanding that choice is just a tool to get us there helps us to shape the choice policies so that we do actually get there.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I want to follow up on what Adam was saying, but also ask something related to the campaign this fall. I found the car analogy really bad, actually, because if I'm buying a car, I look at the Kelley Blue Book, I read the car pages, I look at Consumer Reports. There's ways of rating cars on performance and quality and what people think about them. And it seems to me, one of the earlier questions, people were rattling off states, and I was struck by how many of those states are states in play in this fall campaign, like Florida and Ohio and
Arizona.
And it just seems like in many of these states that are in play, this choice debate is really going on. And yet, like, I know that there have been reports that cyber schools are doing terribly in Michigan and Pennsylvania, but they were expanded there. The Florida Education Commissioner just resigned over questions about assessment, I think. I mean, so it seems like people out there in the states are very confused about this issue in particular and about how to gauge schools, whether it's right for their children. And I don't want to speechify here, but just one other observation. When I was in Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago, I mean, I saw more commercials for K-12 Inc. on TV than I saw for the presidential campaigns in a state that's a key state. And if I was a parent watching TV, that looked like a car commercial to me, not a way to sort of independently assess whether that was the right school for my child.
I just wanted to respond to the car analogy and to your response that it's a problem if kids are in a Yugo. Well, Yugo is one thing, but the cheapest cars on the market today are safer and more reliable than 30 years ago, right? And a lot of the difference between cars is luxury items. Does it have leather, right? How fast does it go? Even though I can't go over 65 on the highway, can it go 200? So a lot of these aspects of cars and the differential between them are bells and whistles and things that are not central to their functionality, right? And so right now we're talking about whether we have a functional education for poor kids, and we don't. The analogy is even the poorest families in a market have access generally to functional items. If you subsidize them through private charitable giving, education tax credits, or vouchers, then they can buy what the middle class can buy. So this distinction, I don't think is as big as you think, and we're never going to eliminate differences between people. Okay, people have tried to eliminate poverty and equalize all outcomes in societies. It generally ends up with a lot of dead people. And I don't think that should be the framework, but better or worse. Can we make this better? And does the market, do these private sector alternatives actually do a better job at delivering what we all want?
Little mild hyperbole, I think it's fair to say.
If you want all equal outcomes, there's, I think, generally dead bodies around that.
Let me speak to the one part of the question about like what's happening during the campaign season and what's going on here. I think hats off to the editors of this book for trying to focus empirically and then explain that there's a lot of differences to this, a lot of nuances, big challenge, hard to do in a book. For a campaign, it's even harder to sort of get down to the sound bites. And it's the sound bites that are pretty likely to simplify and appeal primarily to values. It's hard to get data into campaigns like that. But I think it's important to realize, I come from Colorado, where we have as many people in charter schools as we do exercising inter-district choice. We have, a ton of people are making choices. And when you talk to parents, they don't really think about which type it is and what movement they're part of very often. They pick schools and they move around and they go to them. The evolution of some of the school board members to say, well, I can't really be opposed to all the families exercising choice because a ton are. It's different than it was over time. It's shifted over time, and I'd suggest that the public is looking for schools that want them to be good, and sometimes we have this value rhetorical debate that gets off onto particulars without realizing that most people just want good schools, and they're beyond some of this. They're looking for quality and other things they value, and they're making choices through a variety of mechanisms, and the people who are governing these systems, they deal with the details. And the politicians, in general, they support choice and they support good schools, and that's bipartisan. The presidents have supported charter schools since the movement got started. Both parties, multiple administrations. It's been a bipartisan thing, especially at the national level.
Yeah, and I would still say that the debate should be alive and well, because I'm not sure that it's sustainable. I'm not sure that the position of the president and the bipartisan thing that you should grow the charter sector is really sustainable. I'm not sure that it doesn't create more stratification, that it doesn't create more confusion for parents, and I would really question, as we work with districts where they've been closing and turning around schools and closing, whether it's Philadelphia or New York or Newark or Pittsburgh. Closing schools, parents holler about it. It takes 5 years to close even what's a so-called bad school, because actually it's really a problem for a family if their school closes. So I don't think we're at all kind of on a path that we should sort of say, oh, we've sort of got the paradigm shift that we need. I think we're very far from it, and but, you know, hopefully these kinds of conversations will help us a little bit.
I think we've got a great idea for a day-long panel. I'm going to take one last question, but before I do, this is at the conclusion of this wonderful discussion we've had, I do need to point out that there are a number of upcoming events here at the National Press Club, and I'd like to draw attention to a few of those. October 2nd, there will be a National Press Club luncheon with Arnie Duncan, who is the Secretary of Education. That's here at the Press Club. September 13th, there will be a luncheon with James P. Hoffa, who is the President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. September 6th, Kathleen Turner, actress extraordinaire, will be speaking at the Press Club as well. And on September 12th, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, will be talking about a number of things, in addition, the horrible shooting that happened at his offices there in Chinatown. So, very last question goes to the gentleman in the back.
I'm interested in finding out to what extent for-profit schools are a factor in primary and secondary education. Are they an increasing presence, and are there data comparing their performance to public and other nonprofit schools?
Yeah. Right now, we're seeing the for-profit schools largely are growing and expanding through the charter school sector. About 35% of the nation's charter schools are operated by private entities or education management organizations, and about half are for-profit and half are nonprofit. When we look at the nonprofits, the states where there's larger concentrations of the nonprofits, they tend to perform better. The states with high concentrations of for-profit schools tend to perform less well. The research out there on the for-profit schools, a lot you have to depend on what they say themselves, and they tend to say that they do really well. The independent research is showing that they're not performing very well. There have been a lot of concerns recently about the level of profit making, and that frustrates me sometimes, because I always wonder, especially when these concerns are raised by policymakers, because why should we be concerned about that? They are for-profit companies. They are operating. We've invited them into the education sector, and they are doing what they are designed to do, which is pursue private interest and pursue profit. And the big dilemma here is coming back to the issue about thoughtful policymaking. How do we put in place the proper incentives and the right safeguards, so if we are going to have these operators in the public school sector, how can they pursue the public good and the public's best interest? But they are increasingly getting attention, and they're controversial because of the level of profit from some of the companies that game the system. And again, it's not so much the problem of the companies, because they are doing what they are designed to do. Unfortunately, it's an issue for our policymakers that we have to think about better ways to put in place safeguards and incentives so that they will pursue the public good.
All right, I want to thank your panelists, one and all, for being here. It's been a thought-provoking conversation at the least. And thank you to our C-SPAN audience. Have a wonderful day.
Before I hand this over to Gary Miron, I want to give a preliminary answer to my earlier question. What is school choice? There is a widespread misconception about school choice, that it's a complete policy in itself. In reality, it's a broad policy tool that can be included as part of a complete policy, of a complete education policy. It's not a policy in itself any more than professional development is a policy in itself, or bell schedules are a policy in themselves. At the most basic level, school choice is simply an approach to student assignment. I might tell you, for instance, I favor school choice, and my statement can be coherent in the sense that I might be a libertarian, or that I buy into certain assumptions about the benefits of competition or whatnot. But when you hear me make a statement like, I favor school choice, your next question should be, well, how do you favor structuring or using school choice? That is, what does your policy using school choice actually look like? Let me end with something that I hope will provoke some conversation as we open this up. It seems to me that our lawmakers and our candidates for office are not, in fact, asking these sensible questions. It seems like they're wrongly looking at school choice as a policy, not as a tool. And this misunderstanding blinds them to all the ways that school choice tools can be used. So we end up with choice-based policies that have a set of rules arrived at through default or through political pressure, rather than careful and hopefully evidence-based deliberation. Simply put, if we don't ask the right questions, we don't tend to get the right answers. Thank you. Gary? The school choice universe. The main rationale for this project was that while there are scores of other school choice books out there, they cover only one or two topics, or more often, one or two types of choice. So the first thing we did was to think about all the issues prompted by choice-based policies. Listen to this list. It's surprising how many issues there are. We have basic philosophical and democracy issues. We have questions about legality and litigation, how parents make choices, who chooses and why, how choice schools are held accountable, how choice is funded, and what incentives arise out of those funding choices. Teacher quality issues, questions about innovation and innovativeness, effects on segregation and stratification, competition effects of choice schools upon other schools, and of course, the effects of choice policies on measured student outcomes. So for the book, we asked experts in each one of these topics to tell us what research, what is the evidence base on all these different issues. But we also started to think about, what do we mean by school choice? School choice isn't a single thing, so we identified a half dozen different types of choice. Charters and vouchers were certainly two of those, but we also pointed authors to homeschooling, to cyber schools, to magnet schools and other types of intra-district school choice, often called open enrollment policies, to between-district school choice, and to tuition tax credits that provide a public subsidy to private school tuition, similar to vouchers. I call these neo-vouchers. Now,
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I want to cover three general points. I want to talk about the arguments for and against school choice. I want to share a few comments about the overall prevalence of school choice, how many students are participating in choice programs across the nation. And I also want to talk again about this point about the importance of policy for policymakers to be thoughtful as they plan, develop, and implement school choice programs. But first, let's talk about the arguments. One of the key arguments that we see raised up about school choice is that it's going to bring in that entrepreneurial spirit into our education system, and that through competition, schools will get their acts together and perform better. And this is an argument that we often hear. On the other side, opponents often say that that competition also comes with profit making, because we're bringing in private groups that are going to bring that entrepreneurial spirit, and there'll be winners and losers. There's also a concern from the opponents that with this competition, with the involvement of private actors, that we're going to lose control of the schools, mostly through privatization. Another argument for school choice is the way that when parents can look at their students' unique needs, they can identify school choices that would best match those needs. And the school system can be more efficient and effective when schools are, with their unique learning styles and unique pedagogical profiles, when those are matched with students when parents match their students with those different choices, we're going to have better schools. With that sorting preference, that's one argument for. On the other hand, opponents are often saying, well, there's sorting that goes on, but the sorting can occur by demographics, and that school choice can promote segregation by race, by class, by ability.
Welcome to this morning's Newsmaker here at the National Press Club. School choice, what works, what doesn't, and what will they say about it on the campaign trail, and perhaps most importantly, is it true? That is the topic of this morning's panel discussion. With us we have Dr. Kevin Wellner of the University of Colorado and the director of the National Education Policy Center. We have Dr. Gary Miron of Western Michigan University. Dr. Alex Medler, he's the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Mary Filardo is with us. She is the Executive Director of the District of Columbia's 21st Century School Fund. And finally, Dr. Adam Schaefer is a policy analyst. He's with the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. I also want to point out that Drs. Wellner and Miron are two contributors to a new book that's called Exploring the School Choice Universe, Evidence and Recommendations. It's being released this week, and the book raises questions that are critical to the performance of school choice programs. Just to lay down a bit of the ground rules, first of all, we're going to have statements from our panelists, and the remainder of the time will be reserved for questions, which start with who, what, when, where, why, how, not pontification, and I will be holding everyone to that. I also want to ask that anyone coming in, please make sure that the ringers, buzzers, vibrators on your telephones, pagers, whatever else are turned off. We do not want to be rude to our speakers while they're talking. So, Dr. Wellner, are you to begin? Sure. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Education is shaping up to be a major issue in this education cycle, in this election cycle, excuse me. The president has devoted the past week to education, starting with a radio address on Saturday, and continuing with a swing through Ohio, and then yesterday he was in Las Vegas talking about budget cuts and teachers and growing class size. School choice is a big part of the education discussion. Governor Romney has made the voucherization of Title I and IDEA, or special education funding, a centerpiece of his educational policy. Essentially what he's promoting is federal vouchers. And his proposed policy would mark a huge change in the federal role. President Obama has also strongly promoted school choice policies, particularly charter schools. His strategy relies to a great extent on scaling up nonprofit education management organizations that are thought to be successful in working with students in high poverty communities. But as we'll discuss, vouchers and charter schools are only two of the many types of school choice, and one voucher or charter policy can look and act very differently from another. So what is school choice? And how can we most sensibly understand and use school choice? Gary Miron and I, along with two of our colleagues at the National Education Policy Center, Patricia Hinchy and Bill Mathis, we set out to answer that, and our project resulted in the book that Jamila Bey just mentioned, exploring